I stayed up until 3 a.m. the night before my sister's wedding. My name's Madison, and I was the maid of honor, or at least I thought I was. I ironed the napkins until the cotton smelled faintly of starch and lemon, tied 27 satin ribbons into loops so identical a seamstress would have approved, and climbed a ladder twice to reroute string lights that kept flickering like nervous fireflies above the backyard venue my parents had rented. I did it because I loved my sister Alyssa, and because I had learned long ago that love in my family was measured in errands completed and problems solved. Alyssa was the kind of person who drew attention like planets pull at moons, polished, easy to read, and always perfectly placed in the center of every photograph. She'd been the homecoming queen in high school, the one our parents left smiling at award ceremonies and parent nights, the girl teachers wrote to universities about. She never needed to roll up her sleeves, someone else did that for her. Me, usually. I was the fixer, the quiet hands that smoothed collars, calmed vendors, and plugged holes no one else noticed in plans that looked flawless on paper. That night felt ordinary in its small betrayals. The florist had delivered the wrong shade of peonies, too coral for the muted blush Alyssa had chosen, and the string lights had been bought as warm white, but cast shards of yellow that clashed with the pale linens. The cake decorator, who had promised a 3-tiered buttercream bloom, showed up with a modern geometric confection in stark white fondant, cold and alien against the romantic aesthetic we pinned on mood boards for months. Alyssa shut herself in the bridal suite and cried, a soft, hot sound that made my chest contract. She told me she'd ruined everything. I told her she hadn't, because she needed to hear it. When she said, "Don't worry, I'll fix it," there was a tremor of uncertainty behind her voice that I recognized from childhood, the same hesitation she had when a question asked for answers she didn't want to find. I kissed the corner of her temple and left to do what I always did, make things right before anyone else could see the crack. Fixing the cake meant calling every bakery between here and the interstate until I found someone willing to rise to the ridiculousness of an overnight, bespoke reconstruction. It meant the soft negotiation of a fee that would make a normal person flinch, the hum of a delivery van that smelled faintly of sugar and plastic, the veteran baker who looked at a photo of Alyssa's dream and said, "Okay, we can do an emergency bloom, but I'll need a picture of the dress and the exact shade of the peonies." So I went back, climbed into my closet for the dress's fabric sample, and drove across town at midnight for ingredients and second opinions. Fixing the lights meant rewiring a string that the rental company insisted had worked fine in the warehouse, rewiring while the air held its breath and the neighborhood slept, my fingers sticky with glue and the adhesive from a roll of tape I'd used to pin menus to the centerpiece stems. I learned to work with the kind of meticulousness that borders on obsession, no visible knots, no uneven spacing, every bulb the same distance from the next. The ladder swayed under me twice. Once I swore aloud and the ladder answered with a small shudder as if my voice had startled it too. I held my breath each time until the bulbs blinked steady, and then I let out a laugh that came out hollow in the cool night. Fixing the napkins was a ritual of small, precise motions. My grandmother used to smooth linens with a practiced hand, and sometimes while the iron steamed, I imagined her judging the fold I had made. This corner too blunt, that crease too pronounced. Folding napkins became a way to remember her. Each crease I set was a word I couldn't say aloud. I am here. I see you. I will not let anything go wrong. There were other tasks beneath the more visible ones, things that didn't look like heroism but felt like the backbone of the day. I rewired the battery packs for the uplights so they wouldn't die in the middle of a first dance. I labeled the favor boxes in tiny looping script so the cousins wouldn't argue over someone else's truffle. I timed the playlist with the DJ, sliding him my pen-scrawled index cards of must-play songs, ones that would make people remember, not just nod politely. I synchronized the timer for the mosquito repellent sprays because nothing undermines romance like a swarm of Midwestern mosquitoes at sunset. And while I worked, memories stacked themselves in my chest like a pile of polished plates. I saw Alyssa at 8, unlaced shoelaces and asking me to braid them into 2 tight ropes. I remembered the science fair when her volcano model had tipped and the glue had smeared across the table, and my father, impatient, had muttered that it was just another mess. I had stayed, wiping plaster from her fingers until the teacher had crowned them both winners because someone sensible always did the sensible work. That pattern, her public shine and my invisible scaffolding, was so old it felt like an inherited rhythm rather than a choice. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because the work itself steadied me, because hovering in the periphery had taught me how to see the seams others walked through. I did it because I believed, sometimes painfully, that being useful would keep people from leaving, that reliability is a kind of love they can always rely on. There was also, I admit, a part of me that liked the control. When I tightened a knot or smoothed a drape, I could will the world into its intended shape for at least one evening. At a time the sun was a pale promise on the horizon, the house smelled like coffee and candle wax and the faint sweetness of buttercream. My hands were marked with tiny burns from the iron and faint scratches from clipping stems. My lungs wanted oxygen more than sleep, but I sat on the front step for a minute and watched the street wake up. Mailboxes yawning, a dog being walked like a regular heartbeat. Alyssa opened the front door in a borrowed robe, quietly surprised at the order I'd restored. She leaned against the frame, eyes rimmed with red, and without ceremony she said thank you. Those two words landed heavier than any applause. I'd done what I promised. I had made the day presentable possible. I had wrapped our world in ribbons and light the way I always did. In the quiet between the bird calls and the beginning of bridesmaids' whispers, I allowed myself a single small satisfaction. For all my invisible labor, the day might be perfect for her. That was enough, at least for now. The reception hall glowed under chandeliers that refracted light into 1,000 fractured rainbows across the polished wood floor. The smell of roses, fresh bread, and subtle vanilla from the wedding cake mingled in the warm air, creating the illusion of perfection, a family of celebration. The tables were arranged with precision, linens ironed to a fault, crystal glasses catching the overhead glow, silver cutlery lined in perfect geometric order. At the head, near the dance floor, sat the family table, its elegance rivaling anything in the wedding magazines I had scored for months in preparation. This was where family was meant to sit, where I thought I belonged. I approached it with a careful step, scanning for my place card, my heart unexpectedly fluttering like it had always been uninvited to hope. 3 chairs, one for Mom, one for Dad, one for Elisa. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. There had to be a mistake, a missing card, an oversight. I lowered my voice and leaned toward my mother, whose posture was rigid, her smile faint and tight. "Hey," I said, careful, almost timid. "Where am I sitting?" Her eyes flickered briefly, confusion, or was it something sharper, crossing her face? She bent close and whispered, her voice almost apologetic but tinged with something colder than I wanted to hear. "Oh, honey, we thought you'd be at the friends' table. The family table is just for immediate family." Immediate family. The words clanged in my ears, metallic and alien. Immediate family. The irony nearly choked me. I was literally her daughter, blood and bone and years of unseen work. I had stood in her shadow all my life, yes, but had I not earned at least the acknowledgement of presence at the table where family sat? I turned my head toward Alyssa, searching her eyes for recognition, for the subtle nod of shared understanding I had once taken for granted between us, but she avoided me. Her gaze darted down at her napkin, her fingers twisting at the edge as though the conversation, the invisible tension, had nothing to do with her. And in that avoidance, in that precise act of turning away, I understood that everyone knew exactly what this empty chair represented. 3 weeks prior, the sting had begun, long before the reception. I had accidentally overheard my parents speaking in hushed tones in the study, papers spread across the desk. A trust fund. $240,000 earmarked for Elisa's future, established by our late grandmother. A fund I had never been told about, never even hinted at. It had been labeled for grandchildren's futures, a phrase that had always sounded inclusive, egalitarian, fair. Until I realized it was not for me, not for Madison, not for the daughter who had always labored in silence to support the golden one. Only for Elisa. Only for the visible, only for the perfect, only for the celebrated. I felt a tightening in my chest that made my lungs ache. Every unnoticed gesture, every midnight spent smoothing out ribbons, fixing fallen flowers, correcting vendors. Errors suddenly burned in my memory like fuel on a quiet fire. That night, I had carried the weight of perfection for someone else. And now this, an empty chair where my name should have been, was the physical manifestation of everything I had always suspected but never allowed myself to voice. The silence of omission, the exclusion that said without words, "You are secondary, you are invisible. You do not matter here." I smiled tightly, a brittle thing, and stepped away from the head table. The friends' table was a few rows over, occupied by Ethan's college acquaintances. They greeted me politely, unaware of the undercurrent of betrayal that hung around my shoulders like a shawl. I sat, forcing myself to arrange the silverware properly, even here in the margins, in a place I had never imagined I would inhabit. Cold salmon sat on my plate, the edges drying from the heat of the room, and I ate mechanically, noticing the subtle glances my absence at the family table had prompted. The corner I occupied felt like a cage, but also like a vantage point. From here, I could see everything: the smiles, the laughter, the toasts, and the way my parents' eyes swept the table, oblivious or deliberately blind to the one person who had orchestrated the day's success in silence. Every gesture, every congratulatory nod given to Alyssa, resonated like a drumbeat I could not answer to. I traced the lines of the table decorations with my eyes, noting the slight imperfection in the flower arrangement. No one would notice except me. Every crease of the napkins seemed sharper, more pronounced, reflecting the absence of the person who had ironed them. The silence of my empty place was louder than any music, more conspicuous than any spotlight. And in that corner, as I sat eating alone among strangers, I realized that the empty chair was more than a chair. It was a statement, an edict, a declaration of worthlessness sanctioned by the people who should have known better, the ones who had taught me that love could be measured in ribbons, in folded napkins, in invisible labor. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the cold salmon and polite smiles, a quiet, simmering awareness began to form. It was the recognition that I had always been seen, but only when useful, only when invisible effort could be transformed into another person's triumph. The empty chair was cruel, yes, but it was also a lens, focusing the truth of my family into sharp clarity. It made the invisible visible, if only for a moment. And as the soft hum of conversation and laughter continued around me, I sat, straight-backed, observing, noting, cataloging every glance, every gesture, every small injustice that had carved its mark into the fabric of this night. My presence and absence had never been more apparent, and in that painful recognition, something began to shift inside me, a quiet, steady pulse of awareness that I was, despite the omission, still here, still capable, still watching. The family table had 3 chairs, one for Mom, one for Dad, one for Elisa, one empty. And I, Madison, sat in the shadows, absorbing it all, counting the cost. Halfway through the reception, the air felt heavier than the soft glow the chandeliers suggested. Ethan's mother stepped forward, glass raised, her voice ringing through the polished hall with practiced warmth. To Alyssa, so graceful, so giving, and to her family for raising such a remarkable young woman. Polite claps followed, smiles stretched wide across faces lit by golden candlelight, laughter fluttered in polite bursts. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a crisp napkin, sniffing softly, leaning slightly toward Dad as if to punctuate their pride with silent intimacy. The applause rolled past me like a wave, and with each clap, my chest constricted, heat pooling behind my ribs in a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and painfully familiar. I tried to focus on something else, the crystal goblets that caught the light, the glimmer of my sister's bracelet as she laughed at a joke from Ethan's cousin, but the ache wouldn't let me. Each compliment, each glance of admiration directed at Alyssa, hammered at my awareness of absence. My hands, resting against the smooth surface of the table, tightened involuntarily, fingers white at the joints. The burn in my chest escalated, creeping into my throat, making it hard to swallow, hard to breathe. The room felt claustrophobic, the cheerful chatter a distorted background to the red haze of humiliation and betrayal that blurred everything else. I couldn't take it anymore. Not this blatant exclusion, this calculated preference, this erasure. I stood up quietly, careful not to draw attention, sliding my chair back with the faint scrape of wood against polished floorboards. Guests barely noticed, too caught up in the echoing laughter, in the clinking of silverware and glasses, in the curated harmony of celebration. I slipped outside, the cool evening air striking my flushed face, chest heaving. Above me, the string lights I had strung hours earlier blinked like distant stars, each bulb steady and deliberate, a mocking reminder that the perfection I had orchestrated went unacknowledged. I inhaled deeply, tasting the night, sweet exhaust from passing cars, the faint floral residue from the tinted blooms, and a whiff of the buttercream cake now resting at the head table. My fingers fumbled with the phone in my pocket, its smooth surface cold and grounding against my palm. And that's when I heard them through the thin wall of the tent, voices low but unmistakable. Mon's tone was calm, almost casual, but the words struck me like a slap. Madison's always been different. Alyssa appreciates things. Madison just doesn't understand her place. Different. My chest tightened further. My hands, still clutching the phone, trembled. The word felt like an indictment, a sentence passed without trial. I had been different all my life, silent, diligent, invisible, but the implications stung more sharply in that moment than it ever had before. Dad's response was measured, almost deliberate, a statement wrapped in condescension. We just didn't want drama. Let Alyssa have her moment. Drama. The word made my stomach churn. Was this what they thought of me? That my presence, my history, my labor, the sleepless nights, the hands blistered from ironing linens, the hours spent negotiating with decorators, bakers, florists, and DJs, was nothing more than potential disruption. My love, my effort, my commitment had been reduced to a theatrical inconvenience. I wanted to scream, to hurl every piece of indignation at the canvas of this night, to shatter the decor and demand recognition. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, a quiet, ferocious clarity settled over me. My fingers swiped over the phone, activating the recorder in a few deft motions. I captured their words, the indifference, the judgment, the willful erasure, not for revenge, not for immediate confrontation, but for truth. Because in that moment, something crystallized. Something I had tried to ignore, something I had buried beneath years of compliance, of invisible labor, of silent caretaking. I realized with a clarity as sharp as the crisp evening air that my parents would never see me, not truly, not voluntarily, until I forced them to look. Until I held the mirror up and refused to let them look away. I leaned against the tent flap, the recording humming silently in my hand, feeling the weight of all the nights I had stayed up, the hands I had burned, the silent gratitude I had expected and never received. Anger coiled around my spine like a living thing, but it was precise, purposeful. It didn't blind me, it focused me. It demanded action, demanded acknowledgement, demanded that the story of my efforts and of my erasure would no longer go untold. The laughter inside the tent felt distant now, almost irrelevant. I could hear the faint clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of toasts, the squeak of polished shoes on the dance floor, but none of it reached me. I was suspended outside the curated perfection, suspended in a moment that was mine alone, tasting the clarity of my own self-recognition. I exhaled slowly, letting the first whisper of resolve fill the spaces where humiliation had pressed. This wasn't about disrupting Alyssa's night or undermining her happiness. It was about asserting my own existence, about declaring silently but irrevocably that I was more than a chair left empty, more than a footnote in the narrative my parents preferred. And in that charged, quiet night, under the twinkle lights I had hung with my own hands, I understood nothing, not tradition, not decorum, not their judgment, would ever make them see me unless I made them look. The recording in my pocket was more than evidence, it was a signal, a reckoning. And I was ready to let it speak. 2 hours later, the DJ's voice boomed over the polished speakers, calling everyone to the dance floor. It's time for the slideshow. The announcement carried an energy of celebration, a moment meant to honor Alyssa and Ethan, to make the couple feel cherished, surrounded by laughter and applause. I walked slowly, deliberately, past tables of guests craning their necks, past gleaming centerpieces that reflected the golden light of the chandeliers, and towards the back where the DJ's laptop sat. Except, it wasn't the version they expected. Earlier, when I had stepped outside to catch my breath, to collect myself after hearing my parents' careless words, I had slipped my USB drive into the DJ's laptop. It was a quiet act, almost invisible. The drive contained the version of the slideshow I had edited late into the night, after discovering the $240,000 trust that Alyssa had received without a word to me. Initially, I hadn't planned to use that version, not yet, not at a wedding, but something inside me had shifted. This was the right moment. As the first images flickered on the screen, softly lit childhood snapshots of Alyssa and me, our smiles frozen in time, I felt a brief pang of nostalgia. Soft piano music filled the room, a gentle lull that made the laughter and murmurs of the guests seem almost reverent. The slideshow unfolded innocently at first. Birthday parties, family vacations, moments of unremarkable but warm happiness. The audience laughed at the awkward hairstyles, cooed at the baby pictures, and clapped at the sight of Alyssa in her first ballet recital. Then the tone shifted. The music lingered, but the images began to focus differently. Photographs of me appeared alone, quietly working behind the scenes, decorating the reception at 3 a.m., meticulously adjusting Alyssa's veil, folding napkins with precise corners, kneeling to fix crooked tablecloths, sweeping up spilled confetti. No one had noticed me at the time, but now the camera immortalized my efforts, every small, invisible labor made visible to everyone. And then it happened. The audio began, faint at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually swelling to fill the room with a clarity that made every head turn. The voices of my parents, their conversation I had recorded in the tent earlier, rang out through the speakers. Madison's always been different. Let Alyssa have her moment. A hush fell over the room so suddenly it felt unnatural, like the air itself had been swallowed. Guests froze mid-bite, mid-laughter, mid-toast. Alyssa's face paled, her soft laugh disappearing, her eyes wide with shock as recognition dawned. My parents, her parents, stiffened, frozen like statues carved from shame, eyes darting around the hall as if searching for an escape. I remained at the back, calm, steady. For the first time in years, they weren't ignoring me. For the first time, they had to confront the person they had overlooked, dismissed, and diminished. Every whispered slight, every small, invisible act of erasure, echoed now through the hall, amplified by the music and the images and the undeniable truth of what had been captured. When the slideshow ended, the lights came back on. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating, charged with the weight of revelation. My parents' hands shook slightly, my mother's clutching her napkin as if it were a shield, my father's tightening around the edge of the chair like he might be pulled under its gravity. Guests murmured, exchanged glances, some whispering questions, some staring in stunned silence. I walked to the microphone, each step deliberate, my heels clicking against the polished floor like the steady beat of a drum. I didn't hesitate. I didn't falter. My voice carried across the room, calm but edged with steel. I stayed up until 3 a.m. making my sister's wedding perfect. The next day, there were only 3 chairs at the family table, and mine wasn't one of them. But I guess I finally got my seat. The words hung in the air, clean, unassailable, undeniable. Silence followed, not the polite silence of courtesy, but the heavy silence of realization. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't linger for acknowledgement. I had spoken. I had been seen. And in that act, I had claimed a measure of justice, however brief, however private. I set the microphone down. The crowd remained quiet, the images of my labor and their words still lingering in the minds of everyone present. I turned and walked away, each step lightened by the knowledge that I had finally made them look, finally forced acknowledgement, finally inserted myself into the narrative that had always excluded me. I didn't need them to applaud. I didn't need them to forgive. For the first time in a long time, I carried the weight of my own recognition, and that was enough. For weeks after the wedding, my phone never stopped buzzing. Each notification felt like a pulse, a reminder that the night I had thought would be mine alone had rippled far beyond the reception hall. Relatives called, their voices a chaotic mixture of fury, guilt, and bewilderment. My Aunt Claire's words trembled between anger and disbelief. Madison, that was uncalled for. How could you? My cousin Jenna, usually so mild-mannered, sounded frantic. Why would you embarrass everyone like that? Some called with apologies. My Uncle David's voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the guilt beneath it. We didn't realize, they didn't mean to hurt you. And my parents, oh my parents, they alternated between outrage and wounded pride. Mom's voice, quivering but sharp, accused, "You've humiliated the family." Dad, always the one to frame his criticisms in measured tones, added, "That was completely unnecessary. You should have left well enough alone." I listened, letting the calls pass over me like water over a stone. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I said only one thing, clear and deliberate. You did that yourselves. Because it was true. They had handed me the empty chair, handed Alyssa the trust, handed silence over recognition. They had created the environment where my only recourse to be seen was to show them the truth in its rawest form. I hadn't invented humiliation. They had orchestrated it years before, layer by layer, through subtle preference, quiet dismissal, and the language of neglect. Then came the most unexpected contact. Ethan, Alyssa's husband, sent a message, tentative but earnest. "Madison," it read, "you didn't deserve that. And I think Alyssa finally knows it." His words hit differently than the angry calls or the heated scolds. There was no judgment here, only acknowledgement. It surprised me that someone so close to the situation could see me, not just the stunt, not just the spectacle, but me, the hours, the effort, the invisibility I had endured. And maybe she did. A few months later, Alyssa herself reached out. She asked to meet at a cafe I frequented, the place with the cracked leather chairs and the smell of roasted coffee beans that always reminded me of quiet mornings before life became performative. I walked in, and there she was, hands wrapped around a mug, the color drained from her face, but determination glinting in her eyes. Without preamble, she slid a check across the table. I looked down. Half of the trust fund, an amount I had never expected, an acknowledgement I had thought I might never receive. "It's not about the money," she said, voice low but steady. "It's about fairness." Her gaze met mine, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of sincerity between us. No pretense, no curation for an audience, just recognition, a raw, unfiltered acknowledgement of what had been denied. We talked for hours, words spilling across the table as we unpacked years of tension, misunderstanding, and unspoken pain. She admitted her guilt, her ignorance, her blind acceptance of the preferential treatment that had always existed. I told her my feelings, how invisible I had felt, how small, how quiet my labor had been, and how much it had mattered to me to be seen. There were tears, yes, but also laughter. Moments of relief so sharp they cut through the heaviness of everything we had carried. That night, walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, I realized something crucial. I hadn't ruined her wedding. I had freed us both from a family built on silence, favoritism, and the illusion of unity. That night hadn't been about punishment, it had been about truth. And in exposing that truth, I had carved a space for honesty, for equality, for acknowledgement. I no longer craved a chair at their table. I didn't need their validation to affirm my worth. I had created my own sense of power, my own recognition, my own family, one that started with the acknowledgement of my own efforts and the restoration of my voice. I was building my own table now, one that wouldn't leave a chair empty for anyone who deserved to be there, including myself. And for the first time, it felt complete. I felt seen, I felt free. And that freedom, solid, unshakable, self-earned, was more valuable than any trust fund, any toast, any seat at a table I hadn't been invited to. I smiled truly for the first time in a long while. The silence that had once felt like weight was now a kind of peace, and the path ahead, my path, was finally mine to shape.